I'm still getting used to that little message from Zoom telling me that recording is in progress. That was not something I heard before, but now they've started doing it. Well, as I think I explained in the email, the Princeton Alumni Weekly, I think basically what happened is they read the article that the New York Times Magazine wrote a few months ago about Daniel Padilla and classics, and wanted to do their own version. So I've been asked to do some version of that about the debate going on in classics about white supremacy and how the discipline is or is not entangled with white supremacy. And ran across some of the things that you've written online, and I gather that you are something of a dissenter from this emerging view. So I wanted to hear a little bit about why what you think about this ongoing debate about classics and white supremacy, and any ways in which you think it might be off the mark. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. Maybe you can just start by telling me quickly a little about what you do, what your specialty is, your academic specialty is.
All right, so that's an easy one. Well, I work on a theme in democracy mainly, and I was at Stanford with Daniel. I studied under Josiah Ober, who's a leading expert in Greek democracy and how it might apply to the modern world.
Okay.
So, I had a pretty traditional classical education. Did classics at Oxford. I did an ancient history degree in London. I went to Stanford, and I basically do ancient Greek democracy, but I'm in a small classics department here in Wellington.
Okay.
So we do a bit of everything. So I teach Latin sometimes. I teach Greek. I teach sort of survey introduction to ancient history. I taught a course on history of epidemics this year. So you have to do a bit of everything,
Right. So. Sure. And so have you been aware of this whole debate over white supremacy and classics for a long time, or is that something that you've noticed more recently?
Well, I think, it's fair to say that it's a fairly recent development. I mean, especially the term white supremacy. I think that the field has been debated for a long time, but I think that particular term and some of the particular claims made recently, I think that I first became aware of them around 2017, 2018. And I wrote a series in Quillette, which you may have looked at. I think that was early 2019. That came out late 2018, early 2019. So that I see, I think there's been a long-running debate in classics about the nature of the field, but I see this recent stuff as a little bit different and quite recent.
And so maybe you can talk a little about what you see as the difference in the current discussions from the past.
Well, I mean, it's hard to say because I wasn't around for the discussions in the 70s and the 90s, and I know that they were quite tough as well. And I've read a few things, Victor Davis Hanson and on one side, and people like Mary Lefkowitz and others. And they were quite tough discussions too. So I don't want to exaggerate, but I do think that the recent wave, I think, has been quite extreme. It's made some quite strong claims. For example, the whole thing about classics being white supremacist. When that becomes a headline, then it's very easy for people to think that what you're talking about is actual members of the KKK teaching in classics departments. And I know it's sort of, people smile now because it's become more part of the discourse. But I think for a lot of the population, that is still what they think of when they think of white supremacists. And you say, oh, the white classics is white supremacists, and they think, oh my God, that's so horrible. They're teaching kids that, we should hate Black people. And then you say, well, what do you mean by that? And they say, well, I think that we shouldn't focus so much on this narrative of Western civilization. We should expand and think about the Near East as well as Greece and Rome. And then I say, I'm happy to do that. That's absolutely fine with me. I think that's a great idea. I also think we can keep doing Western Civ without that being racist. But that's why the recent thing I wrote in the Chronicle of Higher Ed, I was really just trying to say, look, if you want to have a debate, let's have a debate. But one thing is that we need to listen to each other. And the other thing is that we just need to tone it down a bit, rather than let's burn down the field. Let's talk about, do we want to reform in some ways?
And do you think the field needs reform in any way?
I mean, as I said, I mean, I'm not against some of the changes that the people are talking about. And in fact, I left the UK and went to California, partly because I couldn't found it harder to get a scholarship from the UK, found it harder to get funding. But part of it was also that I I wouldn't say I had a strong problem, but I saw the limitations of the old-fashioned English way of doing classics, the old-fashioned European way of doing classics. It was very dusty. It was very based on, constantly doing commentaries on text and redoing editions of text and textual criticism. And I was interested in democracy, especially democracy, ancient and modern. And I found even in the 90s and early 2000s, there was a lot of skepticism, fairly hard-boiled sort of English skepticism about the possibility of even using the classics to say things about the modern world. So on that front, I'm totally down with, what people like Danielle and Sarah Bond and, Walter Scheidel especially are doing. I mean, I studied with people like Walter Scheidel and Ian Morris, and I think that, they look at the ancient world as one culture among others, and they can analyze that alongside other cultures, and they can talk about demography, and they can talk about the coinage and the level of economic development. And I have no problem with that. And as I say, if there was more of that, I think that would be fine. And so again, I just return to this point that if we could frame this in a way where we encourage that work that we want to see, but then I don't think we necessarily have to condemn the old-fashioned stuff as racist. Now, I know that, if you go far enough back into the past, there were actual racists who were classicists. That's clear, Gildersleeve and so on and so forth. But, when I left the UK, there were people writing old-fashioned commentaries. And as I say, I think that work was limited in some ways, but I don't think that I need to, just because they weren't working on world history, or they were just working on the Greeks, the Romans, I don't think that means that they were chauvinists.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we just need to be a bit careful about what we say about people.
I mean, I've definitely had people say to me that just calling the field of Greek and Roman studies classics, that there's an implicit value judgment built into the name of the field, and that value judgment implies that, these particular ancient civilizations were better, and that there's a corollary to that, which is, and they were white civilizations. What do you think about any of that? Is that true, false?
Well, I mean, were they white civilizations?
Well, not that they actually were white civilizations, but that people who are promoting the field are promoting it in this way because they think it's a white civilization which has a genealogy straight through to 19th century Europe.
Well, I mean, maybe we probably get onto that later about whether it's linked to Western civilization. I mean, I will say this because this is another thing that I think has come up very recently, is the whiteness thing. And I'm not going to deny that if you go back far enough, you can find people saying it's all about whiteness. It was all about, white civilization or whatever. But I will say this. I mean, I went to some very conservative institutions in the UK. I was with some very crusty old classicists. I never heard them say anything about this is about white civilization. Mm-hmm. It never even crossed my mind. It just never came up. So as to the title of the field, classics, that's one of the things where I'm very happy to discuss that, because I agree. I mean, I put it this way: I see that argument that we call this classics, and it's saying this is something special. Mm-hmm. So I said in my Colette series, I wouldn't mind. I wouldn't lose sleep over it. I wouldn't sort of be in physical pain if someone renamed the field Greco-Roman studies or something. Mm-hmm. And in fact, there are various departments around the world where they do classics. They do Greek and Roman history and ancient history departments. In fact, that's quite common, especially outside the Anglophone world. That's quite common, because they don't, in other countries in Europe, they don't necessarily have classics per se. Mm-hmm. They have ancient history, and then if sometimes they're in history departments. So Greek and Roman history are being taught alongside, Chinese history and German history and whatever else. Mm-hmm. With the Greco-Roman studies thing, I mean, as I say, I wouldn't mind at all, even if someone came here and said, some administrator from on high said, we're going to change the name of your department, I'd say, okay, can we have more, can you give us more support? Right. Something like that. That would be great. One thing I'd say about that is that, again, like I sort of have a concern that this is, a lot of this is coming from some quite fancy schools in the States. And I have a little bit of a concern about, there are lots of places around the world, including in the United States, where people are doing it in this sort of more old-fashioned Western Civ vein. Maybe those people will come around to the new view. Maybe they won't. I don't think that many of them, I don't really know of any of them that I would say are racist for doing that. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that if there's a little classics department that's teaching Greek and Latin and Greek and Roman civilization and calling themselves classics, that is a sort of a blight on the field, personally. I mean, because of course, the Society for Classical Studies is still called that, and so on and so forth. And the final thing I'd say about the classics as a name is just that there is an argument as well. I mean, as I say, I'm pretty comfortable. If we want to change the name, we can change the name. But there is an argument that, if you went to a Chinese university and there was I don't know if they do have departments called classics, but I know the Chinese classics are a thing, and they've long been a thing, and they were the basis for the imperial examination for centuries. And if you're in that context and you're talking to a Chinese intellectual, and they say, oh, we were examined in the classics, what do you think? Do you think, oh, do you mean Greek or Roman? And you obviously don't think that, because you're assuming that you're in China. So that's so some people would make an argument, well, these are the Western classics. And of course, I know that what I call the radicals, they don't like that argument, because they don't even like the idea that the United States has a culture that in some ways is linked to Greece and Rome. But I mean, a lot of people find that plausible. So that's what I think is going on with calling it classics.
I mean, I think some of these people would also say, when you say, I don't, the classicists that I know are not racist, that they would say, I think, that that's a bit of a red herring, that you can have a system that is, can have systemic racism without having individual people be racist within it. The system that has grown up around them could be racist in its implications and in its origins.
Yeah, okay. Then I think that sort of goes back to the point I was making near the beginning of sort of just be careful with what you're saying, be careful to say things like the field could focus more on Near Eastern cultures rather than it is intrinsically racist. Because I mean, there are quite strong claims out there about it being sort of rooted in white supremacy and stuff like that. And some of those claims are so strong that they do make it seem as if just by teaching Cicero, we're encouraging racism. And, I know that's a slightly different claim to thinking I'm consciously racist, but I also think that that's too strong a claim. I don't actually think that that is having a significant effect on racism. I mean, you've got to remember that the set of people who have taught Greek and Roman studies in a sort of Western civilization vein, maybe not sort of very explicitly, because I don't think it was ever like a very, very heavy-handed thing. But I mean, I've got a book on the shelf. Like this book, it's the Chicago series. What's it called? University of Chicago Readings in Western Civ, right? Western Civilization. And there's a whole series of them. And when were these published? They were used for decades. And when I don't want to I'm trying to name and shame people. When I talk as a TA with Ian Morris, we use the series. I can't find the date, but they were published in the sort of 70s, 80s, 90s. And there's several volumes, and there's a lot of stuff like this. And it was used, it's still being used by lots and lots of people. And so it was used, over the past few decades by lots and lots of people, and many of them quite sort of radical on the left. So I just think that the set of people who have taught and are still teaching Greek and Roman studies in this old-fashioned way, and who think that Western civilization is an absurd idea, that is much greater than the set of people who are, in any way sort of contributing to racism or white supremacy. I personally don't see this as having that big an impact on that kind of thing.
And you also took issue in some of the things that I've seen with the burn it down discourse that's out there around this. Does that strike you as more than just like hyperbole for the sake of provocation? Does it strike you as being a legitimate statement about what people want to see happen to the field?
Well, I've noticed, I try and stay off Twitter, but I've noticed on Twitter that there's been a bit of back and forth about, whether they actually said this and whether they actually meant it. And I mean, I responded to Joanna Hennick's article in the Chronicle of Higher Ed, and the headline is something like, "Let's burn it down."
Well, she probably didn't write the headline, to be fair, but
no, that's what I was gonna go on to say that. That's exactly right. So the headline is something like "Let's burn it down," and then there's a picture of a Greek statue being burned. And I know that I wrote for them just afterwards as well, so I know. And they didn't. I didn't choose my headline either. Having said that, I do think that the radicals have used language that comes close to that. I mean, Haneke herself in the article said things like, "Classicists are the last people to fear who should fear ruins." So there are lots of metaphors of destruction, and I think Danelle in the New York Times piece was quoted as saying something like, I'm not destroying for the sake of it. I want to destroy to rebuild. But there's already an assumption that he's trying to destroy, right? And yeah, I think that there was some similar language in the Society for Classical Studies meeting. So I think that language is around. Maybe I'm being I don't want to police people's language, and I know that a lot of these things are metaphors. But again, I mean, I just think we could be having a discussion that's a lot more profitable if instead of just talking about burning down the field, we talked about changes in various directions and sort of assume more goodwill. I think because I don't really share this view that there are these people who are sort of stubbornly clinging to their white supremacism or their white supremacist narratives or whatever. I was going to say something else, but I've forgotten now.
There seems like there's also a strand of this that is about the underrepresentation of scholars of color in this field, and perhaps a lack of attention to the contributions that scholars of color have made to classics over the decades or generations, however far back. Do you think there's any validity to that critique?
Can I just say, sorry, this is mean, but rude, but can I just say one more thing about the last question?
Of course, absolutely. Yeah, of course.
So the one thing I was going to say in response to the last question was just that this sort of this language of dismantling and burning things down, you sort of have to put it in context of where a lot of classicists are at the moment. And so I work in this very small classics department. We have declining enrollments as they are across the humanities. We make sort of big courses, mythology and stuff like that, and we get some money from that. Greek and Latin enrollments are plummeting, and it's very hard to keep them up because they're intrinsically difficult languages. They're not going to make you much money in life. So, you really need people who are academically dedicated. And the higher ups in the university are saying that they're economically inefficient because they're too small. So they're constantly at us. They say, we need to cut these languages. And for us, we actually think that these languages are valuable. I believe in what I'm doing. I think it's a good thing, otherwise I wouldn't be doing it. Not that it's the most important thing in the world or it's saving people, but I think it's worthwhile. So, and there are lots, so this is actually, I think, the norm. This is the norm. Classics is a very tiny part of academia, and it's shrinking, and it's shrinking quite quickly. It's shrinking just like history and English, but in a way it's in an even worse position. So again, I'm not against having conversations about the direction of the field, especially because I think, quite apart from the moral and political stuff, which is important, we need to think about how we're going to actually get out of this mess. But I think in that context, especially, it can be grating for people at smaller universities to hear all this language of dismantling, because that's exactly what the higher ups want to hear. They'd love to dismantle us. They just want an excuse, and often, in Australia, for example, the government penalized the humanities quite heavily. It's because, one of the things is they think the humanities are worthless. And another thing is that they feel like the center-right party in Australia feels like the humanities are kind of against them politically. So you either have that, or you have, and then if it's the right-wing party, they hate you because you're saying that it's racist and they don't think it's true. And then if it's a left-wing party, they hate you because you're saying it's racist and they do think it's true. So it's just like, if we could just tone it down a bit, then I think that would be helpful. I don't think that's kind of obfuscation. I just think we just need to be more reasonable. But anyway, sorry.
Let me just follow up on that though. Do you think that conversation within classics about these race issues, does that actually endangers the survival of the field, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, in the way I've described, I don't think it's helpful to the smaller places. And I think that if you're in Brown like John Haneke or Princeton like Danelle, you're sitting on these enormous endowments, and you can. This is the thing. I think that I remember I was at Stanford with Danelle, and I remember having these conversations with Ian Morris and Walter Scheidel, and they would say, "Let's transform the field so that it's ancient studies, and we have these departments with we have 7 classicists in the traditional sense, and then we have some ancient sinologists, and we have some ancient Near Eastern studies, and we have these interdisciplinary centers. We can get funding." And I thought at the time, I was like, "This is great." I loved it, and I would still, again, if an administrator at my university came in and said, "We're going to completely transform you, and we're going to we're going to put you in a ready-made, ancient civilizations department, and we're going to hire some sinologists, I would just be over the moon. But this is not going to happen here, right? So it's like, I think you can have that burn it down, build it up conversation at Princeton, but the burn it down conversation at Victoria University of Wellington just looks like smoldering ashes, and then there's nothing else, and they do more engineering. So is that
yes, definitely. And I've heard similar things from other people at smaller places. So I hear what you're saying. So to get back to the question they asked before was about that. I think part of what people also are saying is this is a field in which there are relatively few scholars of color, and arguably the contributions of scholars of color to classics over the past decades or however long have not been, fully recognized or fully appreciated. Do you think there's anything to any of that? Is that relevant here?
I on the second bit, I don't even know enough to say. I haven't sort of followed that part of the debate that closely. I mean, I know that was part of the controversy, with Danielle and Mary Beard doing a talk in which she thought she didn't name enough Black classicists, I think. I mean, so this gets us into the whole problem of demographic imbalances in different professions and fields, and that's a very complicated subject. And I think that things will, become more diverse, and I think that they have become more diverse over time. And I think people like Danielle are a testament to that. And I think there's lots of work being done on outreach, and it's in everybody's interest to have the field available to as many people as possible. And I'd also say, because I'm a member of Heterodox Academy, and Heterodox Academy is all about viewpoint diversity. And the idea is that you improve research by having different points of view. And I also say that, having people from different backgrounds to some extent also correlates with having different perspectives. So all that stuff is good. The only note of caution I'd sound is just that it's very rare, I think, if you have a free society where people choose to go into different professions, different subjects, it's very rare that you're going to get a population or a sample, I suppose, that perfectly matches the background population. So that may not happen soon, it may not happen ever. And if it doesn't happen, it may be for nefarious reasons, and it may not be. And I'll tell you, part of what I'm thinking about with classics is that, well, think about it this way. If you go into academic sinology, worldwide, it's dominated by people who are Chinese or of Chinese ethnicity. Now, I know that classics isn't exactly the same, and that's for an obvious reason, right? It's not the case that there's no one who's not Chinese who studies Chinese history, of course not, but it's demographically, it's skewed, you might say, in that direction. So you have to remember how classics has been composed for the past decades. And again, maybe that'll change, but there's a map online where they look at the number of people who study Greek and Latin at high schools around the world. And basically, Greek and Latin is studied at high schools, as you might guess, in Europe and in the United States. Tiny, tiny bit in Canada, a little bit in Australia, very, very small amount in New Zealand. In New Zealand, there's Latin, which is dying, and there's no Greek at high school. But anyway, so in New Zealand, there's some few hundred students every year do Latin, the whole country, at high school, secondary school. In Italy, I don't want to get the numbers wrong, but they're in the hundreds of thousands. In Germany, they're in the hundreds of thousands. In Holland, they're in the hundreds of thousands. In France, I think tens of thousands. Anyway, I could go around them all, but you're getting an idea of it. They're traditionally very strong in these countries. In Germany and Italy, they have state secondary schools which teach you compulsory Greek and Latin for 5 years. Okay, and so these countries are majority white countries. They're getting more immigration, but that's they're going to be majority white for a while. And so you have all these people, and I've seen this if you go to classics departments, especially in the UK at the moment. I don't know why that is, but anyway, it seems like more opportunities or whatever. But it's full of Italians and Germans, and there's a lot of. I swear, if you did the demographic breakdown of classics professors, even in the US, you'd think, wow, there are a lot of Germans and Italians. And again, you could go to that and say, well, that's because there's a dominant discourse that only Germans can do classics. But I think it's much more likely that it's just part of the traditions of these particular countries.
But I think that the people who disagree with you on some of this stuff would say that those traditions aren't some kind of neutral fact that, was an act of God. Those traditions were born out of a whole series of ideological choices about what classics was going to be and mean, and who it was for.
Well, yes, that's what they would say. I mean, here again, I have some disagreements. I mean, I think that played a role, but so the New York Times article, the view that's given there, and I don't want to caricature it, but it's basically that classics as a field was constructed during the Enlightenment. And I sort of know what they mean, in the sense that, people also say the university as we know it today was created during the 19th century. And that's true in a sense, but it all depends on what you mean by university, because of course, there were institutions that called themselves colleges or universities going back to the 11th century in Bologna and Oxford and Paris. So there's actually been a continuous existence of something called universities. Now, they weren't modern universities. But so in a similar way, the academic field of classics as we know of it, sure, that was an Enlightenment thing, it was a 19th century German thing, but it's not as if there was no engagement with the classical tradition in Europe before then, right? And in fact, I think that part of the reason they studied in Italy so much, part of the reason they study Latin in Germany so much, is because Latin is old Italian, basically. You got to remember that. And French and Spanish and Portuguese, of course, are just dialects, they're modern dialects of Latin. And they do a lot of studying of ancient Greece in Greece. Why do they do that? Is it a construction to bolster their national identity? Partly, yes, but it's not completely arbitrary, right? It doesn't happen that the Italians just suddenly decide, oh, we're the inheritors of the Han Empire, and they all study classical Chinese. No, there is this identity stuff going on, but it's also that they happen to speak this language. And also, you grow up in Rome, you see a lot of ancient Roman stuff. You grow up anywhere in Italy, you see a lot of ancient Roman stuff. And, even where I was in England, which was, of course, seen by the Romans as this sort of distant barbarian outpost.
Right.
You walk around and you see all this, there are Roman roads and there are Roman forts. And, some of the older schools and universities, you see inscriptions in Latin and things like this. So I just see the strength of classics in Europe for me is a more natural thing, really. I think that and again, you can compare this with other parts of the world, where the Chinese imperial exam for centuries, they were asking people to memorize and to study and to recite and so on, the Chinese classics, and that went back to ancient times, right, to Han or pre-Han classics. And you could say, oh, well, they constructed that at a certain point. And so in a sense, they kind of did. They constructed canon. They had to sort of formalize the canon. But in another sense, I think it's just a natural thing that various civilizations do, that they start to sort of, they try and build on what's happened in the past. And in Europe, I think is one of the things that played an especially strong role was just, the Dark Ages. We're not meant to call it that anymore, but, like there's a big fall off in economic productivity and in living standards and stuff in the 8th, 9th, well, after the Roman Empire fell, so 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, maybe even earlier than that. And it doesn't mean there was no culture, but anyway, the people in that time, even in the Middle Ages, they looked back at these great ruins and these great works of literature that they still sort of had around and were being copied in monasteries. And they thought of that culture as sort of, a source of wisdom. And then, by the time they got into the early modern period, they started thinking, actually, the science doesn't really level up, it doesn't really measure up, and they were wrong about the planets, and they were wrong about the human body and all the rest. But in a way, for me, it was sort of natural that they were using these texts, because that's sort of all they had. They looked at them as kind of a big brother for many years, and then eventually they overthrew them. But again, I think that's a sort of process that plays out in most civilizations. Most traditions, most civilizations look back to sort of classical texts. And I think you could say the same thing for Islamic civilization.
And I think you also took issue in one of your pieces with this whole idea of, classics as a creation, a colonial creation or a colonial tool, or at least as seeing that as somehow foundational to this discipline in a way that maybe it isn't to others. Well, I mean, I think that, what I've just said sort of speaks to that in a sense, because it's a similar thing that, it's all to do with, when was classics created? And yes, there was a lot of movement in the colonial period and the Enlightenment period. I mean, depends what you mean by colonialism, right? Whether it's
Vasco da Gama or whether it's the British Raj, and there's quite a long period of several centuries between the two. But I mean, I'm not going to deny, and this has been well documented, that if you read some of the Spanish conquistadores, some of them, I don't think actually it was sort of hugely in the thought of every thuggish Spaniard, but I mean, the more intellectual ones, they read Aristotle saying that they were natural slaves, and they saw that as justification. There's no doubt.
Mm-hmm.
And they also used religion in the same way to justify their oppression and their destruction of Aztec civilization and Inca civilization and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. But the thing I would take, the idea I would sort of push back on is just that there was no idea of the classical past. I mean, maybe this is a caricature, but I sometimes get the impression that they're saying there was sort of no classics, and then they thought, oh, we need to sort of colonialize the world. We need a justification. Let's tie into all this old stuff. It was really like, if you go back to Aquinas, go back like medieval philosophers. Thomas Aquinas is obsessed with Aristotle. Mm-hmm. It's his two main sources of authority are the Bible and Aristotle. And obviously Aristotle's Greek, and then with the Bible, people sort of forget because it's almost too obvious to say. But this is in some ways a classical text. I mean, the New Testament is written in Greek. Old Testament is obviously written in Hebrew. But I mean, like the Christianity grew up as a fusion of, at its roots, it was a fusion of Jewish and Greek culture. So all these things come from the ancient world. Mm-hmm. And so the Europeans were constantly doing this, even before they decided to, take over the world. Mm-hmm. Or spread, start exploring the world.
I mean, do you think is there anything to the argument that classics as a discipline is created in some kind of an intertwining with or effort to justify slavery, colonialism, these kinds of things, or just it's part of the culture already? Your view is it's part of the culture already, and so that's what they turn to, but there's nothing special about that entanglement?
Well, that's what I mean. I just think that if it was a matter of them saying we need to sort of invent something, or even kind of, I don't know, produce something for this particular context of colonialism, then you would find, nothing before, or you would find very little before. And as I say, I think that you find a lot of engagement with the classical past all the way through European history. In fact, in a way, I think that the rest of European history is sort of built on the ruins of Greek civilization and Roman civilization. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have another thought, but I keep forgetting. So.
Okay, that's all right. And do you hold with the general feeling that classics has sort of promoted itself as, the pastime of elites, and thereby in some way, better, more special, above, and this whole kind of attitude of classics has been a problem, or is now becoming a problem?
Yes, I mean, I think that it's not the case that there was nothing wrong with the old-fashioned version of classics, and it was perfect in every way. I think that even in my lifetime, it's been quite snobby, especially in some European countries. But I try and be balanced about these things, because it's been snobby, but it's also, nowadays there are lots of sort of outreach programs trying to get classics into certain schools in England, because in England especially it's associated with private schools, and I think in northeastern United States it's like that too. So there's lots of outreach programs in Britain trying to get it into state schools, and Edith Hall, for example, has written stuff about working class classics that goes quite far back. Even in the early 20th century and before, and I think even the 19th century, there were working class people who were keen on the classics and who were trying to learn about them, and there would be more educated people who'd be trying to work with them. And I've just been reading Tom Jones, the 18th century novel, and there's some soldiers, and they suddenly start talking about Homer, who's read Homer and who hasn't. No, they're not posh people, they're the soldiers. Mm-hmm. So I think that to some extent, yes, it's been the preserve of an elite, and we definitely, there are ways in which we could be less snobby, but I think that actually it's much less of a problem now than it used to be. I mean, I think that in the past there was this problem that people would kind of snort, like the language skills thing. If you sort of got something slightly wrong, they sort of like, what, don't you know that that's a octative, or it's third person plural, but I think that's, in my view, that's almost entirely vanished now. Maybe there are a few cases, but the general tenor of the field now is much more is much more welcoming.
Mhm.
So, and then you got to remember as well, like, just that thing about Europe. I mean, you got to remember that in England, it seems very elitist because it's basically private schools, private boys' schools really that do Greek. And but then in Germany and Italy as well, like what in England would be called grammar schools, you know, so they are selective, and they are sort of bourgeoisie that for various reasons, you know, they tend to be more likely to get into these selective schools. But it's also like not a tiny thing. It's like, you know, hundreds of thousands of people going through that. So yeah, so it has been elitist, but I think that one is changing fast, and it's never been the whole story.
And so but the more welcoming version of classics is coming at this moment when there are fewer people who appear to want to do classics in the first place. Yeah,
it's again, I haven't gone into this in detail, but I mean, I would say as well that it's hard to think about these things because, you know, with demographics, how many people there are in the world now, how many people are educated. You have to remember that, you know, if you go back to the early 19th century in Britain, classics dominated, you know, well, classics didn't dominate, but it was very, very strong in higher education. You know, if you go to Oxford in the early 20th century or the 19th century, classics is probably one of the biggest undergraduate majors alongside things like theology, mathematics, whatever. And obviously that's not the case anymore. I mean, I think we're sort of well under 1% of undergraduate majors, right? Well under 1%, maybe even under 0.1%. So, you know, we're very small. But you've got to remember that there was a huge explosion in higher education in the States with the GI Bill, but across the developed world in the 70s and 80s, and with GDP growth and various types of development. So, you know, it's arguable that in absolute terms, there are as many people doing classics now as in the past. But certainly, as I say, like, what, you know, if you're in a small classics department now, you feel like you're trying to keep the field going.
Do you think I've seen people arguing sometimes that these conversations about racial issues in classics, leaving aside the effect they may have on administrators who are looking for excuses to cut classics, that, you know, arguments about whether these arguments are welcoming to students or are going to encourage students or are going to discourage students from taking classics. Do you have an opinion about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the issues I have with some of the rhetoric that gets a bit overheated, because I think that we can talk about structural disparities and structural racism. I'm happy to have these conversations and go into the statistics and details, but I think there's a danger that if we start saying, you know, classics as a field is unwelcoming to Black Americans, say, or Maori or whatever, ethnic minorities, you know, we're making statements about the field like this is the way it is, that if you're a Maori or a Black American, you will have a tough time in classics. And I'm not sure that that's definitely the case. And I don't, you know, and that would be a shame, because, you know, we want those people to feel free to come here. And I think, you know, we're delighted to have anybody. So, you know, there's a problem that can actually end up excluding people. And it becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy in some ways.
Do you see any evidence of that actually happening on the ground, or is that just your sense of what might happen?
Well, I mean, that's a sense of what might happen if you start saying, you know, this field is terrible to Black people. It just makes sense to me that if I was a young Black high school student thinking about going into classics, and I read that and I thought, oh my God, I'm not going to go into classics. I'm going to go into something else because it's, you know, classics is intrinsically white supremacist. And again, that would be a shame, because maybe you're really interested in the ancient world, and you might find if you went for it, you'd have a good experience. Yeah.
So do you have a sense of where this is all headed? Do you think these discussions are going to result in major changes in the field, or is this just a epiphenomenon?
No, I mean, it's a big deal. There's no doubt in my mind that it's a big deal. I mean, I think some people think there's a bit of a disjunct between the people who are on Twitter and who aren't. And I think that some older scholars just sort of think, oh, that's just some people who are on social media. But you know, the Society for Classical Studies has put out various statements, and it's interesting to me because, for example, they put out a statement talking about how classics isn't about a view of a narrative of Western civilization, narrowly conceived. And I've seen a few classics bodies put out a similar statement. And I'm grateful for the narrowly conceived bit, at least. But I do worry because I just think sometimes it's appropriate for professional associations to put out statements about the direction of the field and what you should and shouldn't do. But I think we should be careful about it because, as I say, like until very recently, the Western Civ paradigm was pretty big in classics. In a way, it was sort of the default paradigm, even though I don't think people sort of thought about it that much. Mm-hmm. But what's basically happened, I think, is in a few years, the sort of authoritative groups, organizations have sort of said, this is bad. Mm-hmm. And I'm a bit, as I say, like I'm always a bit worried, like, okay, so then we have people at Ivy League universities saying that what a lot of people are actually doing on the ground in these small classics department is sort of not correct. And I just think that it needs to, I think it would be nice if the things were a bit more liberal in the sense of, you guys do classics, we'll do, comparative study of ancient civilizations, and we respect what you're doing, and maybe in a few years you'll be convinced by our way and you'll start doing it. Because this, I think, is the way that things really change. And that means that they change, or they change to the extent that they need to change without so much chagrin and people kind of tossing insults at each other. And I read the other day, I looked at the Princeton Classics website. Oh yeah, because there was that controversy about Greek and Latin majors. And they said something, that there was a statement there about the way of looking at the field, and it was all about comparative history and comparative ancient history and things like that. And I thought, great. I literally thought, that's wonderful. That's the stuff I was doing with Ian and Walter at Stanford. It's very exciting. I always love that stuff. Comparative, comparing Rome and China and stuff like that Walter Scheinel does. I think that's marvelous, and it's very interesting, and it's something I wasn't exposed to before. So that's great. But I just think, okay, that's fine. If you're in a department and you're maybe an more old-fashioned classicist, and you're doing, the Western tradition of epic, I think that's okay too. As long as you're not saying, everyone, this is the best, this is the only literature that was ever valuable, and everyone else's literature was worthless and stupid. I think that's fine.
And that term Western civilization that you mentioned, I mean, I've definitely, some of the people that I talk to either put it in quotes like this, or just in their voice are putting it in quotes, that there's something problematic about that term. Do you find that term problematic at all, or do you think they have a point when they find it problematic?
No, I think this is something I talk a bit about in my Quillette series. I think that that it's a thing. That's the debate. I mean, sometimes I think earlier it was sort of like Western civilization has been bad, and okay, that's definitely a conversation we can have, because it's one of the great facts of world history. I mean, great meaning big, not necessarily meaning good. Right. One of the big questions of world history is, okay, once you get into the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, these few European nations start to dominate everybody, and it's amazing. And it's like Chinese don't know why, and the Ottomans don't know why, and so that's still a really big question. And so there's been a lot of literature about why the West took over, how this happened, from different directions, right? From a chauvinistic Westernist side, and also from a kind of Marxist side, a post-colonialist side. But I think it's fairly recently that people have been saying, oh, the West just isn't a thing. And some of their arguments to me aren't very good. I mean, there are things like, well, you can't define the West. You can't draw a firm line around it, which countries are West and which aren't. But that's something that you could say about lots of concepts that we use all the time. Like, if I say I'm going to an art gallery, I like art, and you say, well, what is art? I'm like, I can't really define it. And you're like, well, that's because it's not a thing. It doesn't even exist. So I think some of those arguments are a bit silly, to be honest. So yeah, I think it's a thing. I mean, and then another thing that I think Rebecca Fruto Kennedy has a version of the sort of the argument that was, I think the first person to put it was Gilbert Allardyce. I think that's the name. He wrote an article about this. Name escapes me, in a history journal, and it was trying to say, well, the term only arises around the First World War. I think Kennedy tends to talk more about the Cold War. But anyway, the idea is that it's created in these various contexts in order to justify basically wars, one side in a conflict. But there I would just say, just because there's no term Western, so they look at the exact term Western civilization. And there's a good little book, Stanley Kurtz, what's it called? The Lost History of Western Civilization, where he goes into this a bit. you can say the term Western civilization isn't common until date X, and that again, they can document that. That seems true. But the idea of a tradition, so they use different terms over time, but all the way, you can trace it all the way back to the 19th century. Then they're more likely to talk about a Western tradition or things like that, or Western literature, or they use different terms. So basically, the idea is there, and I think with these things, even if it doesn't have a name, it still exists. Like the Maori didn't have a term for the whole of New Zealand before the Europeans came. This is often the case because they didn't need to define themselves against outsiders until outsiders came, right? And so it's a similar thing, but just because you don't have a term until time X. And I think something similar is going on with Western civilization. People just sort of, like Aquinas just took it for granted that he was in the same tradition as Aristotle, and he didn't need to sort of say that. And I think that partly explains why the term itself only comes around much later.
So the putting it in quotes is, in your view, a denial that it exists rather than a statement that, I'm not saying this is the best civilization anymore. Oh,
it may be that too. I mean, I think that people are, some people are saying that, although I also think, I think Rebecca Fruiter Kennedy, I'm pretty sure that she has statements that it doesn't actually exist. I mean, Sarah Bond at the notorious Society of Classical Studies meeting said it was a social construct. Which again, maybe it's true, but just because something's a social construct doesn't mean it exists, right? Like a marriage is a social construct, but it's existed for many years, thousands of years. And I think, in my article, I was talking about people like Kwame Anthony Paya and David Graeber, who aren't classicists, but their work has been cited with approval by people like Donnell. So I do think they're thinking along the same lines of like, we need to deconstruct the notion of Western civilization.
And specifically the notion of Western civilization as the best kind of civilization, or a civilization that has some special value to us.
Yeah, that too. But I think you need to choose which horse to bet on in that particular one, right? Because you can't both say Western civilization has been overrated and it's actually worse than we think, and also it never existed, right? You have to, it's either bad or it never existed.
Right, okay. I think I covered what I wanted to. Is there anything else you'd like to add that I didn't give you a chance to say?
I don't know. I guess I'll just say it. Yeah, I think we can get through this. I think we can get through this as a field. But I don't, to be honest with you, like I don't find it, I'm not, all sides probably think this. I don't find it pleasant. I don't think it's a pleasant atmosphere in the field right now. I think that we could be more on the same page, because I think we all have an interest in, and not just a pecuniary interest. I think that at some level we all sort of believe in what we're teaching, however we frame it. So my view is just like two things. Just I think we could be a bit more liberal in letting people sort of go different ways in the way they teach this material. And the other thing is just sort of try and be a little bit more careful with rhetoric.